Thank you so much, and it's great to be here this morning. Kia ora, everybody. So I am here. You can probably tell that I am British, but I live in Brisbane. It's all you need. Another damn Australian here. So sorry about that. As you've heard, my background is as a radio presenter a long time ago. This is me. Looking as if I didn't really know what I was doing. Also on this photograph is a guy called Chris Moyles, who went on to be the Radio 1 breakfast show presenter, very big name in UK radio. He's now on a radio station called Radio X. And also on this photograph is a guy who is in prison for killing somebody, so we better move on. Scary thing. Then, as you heard, I worked for the original Virgin Radio, launching the first podcast from a radio station back in 2005, and the first mobile phone streaming app. If you want to see it working, this is it. It's, look at that. Look at the quality there. You could run it on 3 phones. It was the most amazing thing. Then working for the BBC, and now I call myself a radio futurologist. It turns out, if you print your own business cards, you can literally call yourself anything, which is a really handy thing. And I publish a daily podcast newsletter called Podnews.net. If you have any interest at all in podcasting, you should get this. It's free. It's at podnews.net. So today, apologies for the cheap copy of the Auckland, of the big thing in Auckland. This is the cheap copy that they have in Toronto. It's nowhere near as good. But today I'm going to talk about radio and technology and whether radio has a future. And we should probably just focus on the word radio just for a second, because the word radio means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Here's my definition of radio. It's a shared experience with a human connection. That's what radio's really all about, a shared experience with a human connection. And yes, we can have beautiful concrete towers in our cities, but that beautiful concrete tower is just one way of getting content out to people. There are lots of other ways other than just AM and FM. So does radio have a future? Who better to ask than the chief scientist of the UK. This is Lord Kelvin, who invented the ship's telegraph. He invented, or he discovered absolute zero. And he was asked, Lord Kelvin, does radio have a future? And he says, radio has no future, so that's all okay. I don't know what we're doing here, to be quite frank with you. Mind you, he also said that aeroplanes won't work and that X-rays will prove to be a hoax. He lived long enough to realize that X-rays weren't a hoax, but sadly not long enough to realize that radio indeed had a future. Or indeed it had a future because, as we know, television came along in the 1950s, the Walkman came along in the 1970s, MTV came along, and so, as we know, many things have killed the radio star. Enough. So video killed the radio star, as we know. Advertising killed the radio star, you bastards. Spotify has killed the radio star. Quotas of different music that you have to play, that's obviously killed the radio star as well. Vine, if you remember that killed the radio star. And weirdly, Norway killed the radio star. Don't quite understand that one. But that's why when you see journalists talking about radio, they believe all of these spurious, lazy buggles headlines. They believe all of this stuff, and they can't quite believe that people are still listening. Here's a man who listens to the radio. Watch how the journalist goes, what, really?
How do you find your music, what you listen to?
Radio.
You still listen to radio? Yeah.
You still listen to radio?
Well, a lot of people,
don't you?
A lot of people don't listen.
In the car.
Well,
Don't
is it like a
car.
satellite radio station, or are you listening to old kind of?
Just a little thing with a knob.
Okay.
Radio, FM.
Yeah. Well, I noticed you drive yourself around. You drove up here today. What are you listening to in the car? Radio?
Radio.
So, much though it comes as a surprise to that particular journalist who presumably is in New York and presumably just uses the subway to get into work, lots of people tune into radio. In fact, around the world, 9 out of 10 people tune into the radio every single week. And this is data from all over the place. Some of this data is from GfK, from Morton's company. Some of this data is from many other sources as well. And they all come back to 9 out of 10 people are listening to the radio every single week in places like Finland, France, Malaysia, and the independent state of Brisbane. And radio is not just used by 9 out of 10 people every single week. Radio is the most popular thing that we put into our ears. 66% of all of the audio that we put into our ears is live radio. And that's a tremendous thing. And yes, you hear a lot about podcasts, 4%. You hear a lot about streaming audio like Spotify and Pandora, but really 66% of all of the audio that we put into our ears is radio, and that's a tremendous thing. You saw a version of this graph from Morton earlier. This is showing how people tune into the radio, and you can see that radio is very big at breakfast time, of course, as we all know. And podcasting and other services such as that are far, far smaller. This is data from the UK. And I think that all of this is a good sign in terms of the future of radio. So this is a good sign. This is also a good sign, which I thought I'd show you. Radio, of course, many people say, oh, yes, James, this is all fine, but radio, nobody young listens to the radio anymore. It's all old people like Sir Paul McCartney. And, well, that's actually not true. Here we are in the US, where arguably radio is worst for young audiences, and there they are, tuning into the radio just as much as pretty well any other age group are. But people turn around and say, oh, yes, but young people listen less to the radio. And they're right, young people do listen less to the radio, but young people consume media less. And because young people consume media less, you can actually see that if you just have a look at a proportion of the media that they consume, they're consuming just as much media as all of us. But the difference is that younger people are listening to radio in lots of different ways. So all the green here is people listening to the radio on lots of different devices. And yes, radio through the radio is still number one in this. It's really high in terms of average hours. It's really high in terms of CUME, the amount of people who are tuning in to radio. But there are lots of other ways of tuning into radio as well, because radio is becoming multi-platform. It's on lots of different devices. Here's another example, a slide that I spent literally minutes putting together from Germany. And this is showing, again, how people are consuming radio. The Germans call radio call FM radio UKW, because they're German, it turns out. And you can see that there's a lot of listening to FM radio, but you can also see that internet and DAB is increasing in terms of Germany. It's no longer just AM, FM. Data from the UK, again, showing that AM/FM radio, yes, it's big, but also DAB is big, and smartphones, speakers, which we'll get onto later, and other devices are also really big. In Australia, lots of people claim to listen to the radio on things other than a radio in their home. And the same data comes out from the US as well. The amount of people tuning into radio on new devices is significantly up. So it's no wonder that the Radio Centre, the UK equivalent of the TRB, says that their favourite emoji really should be a picture of a radio, but radios don't look like that anymore. They look like a watch or a mobile phone or a computer or just headphones. So, you know, what do you go for? And it's why, you know, a good radio futurologist should quote from a book that comes out in 6 months' time, and so I'm going to. It's why many people actually talk about radio again as not just terrestrial FM broadcasting, but think of yourself as someone who creates audio experiences that accompany listeners through their life, regardless of the platform it appears on. It's why when you look at TV ads for radio in the UK, you see them promoting all of the different ways you can tune in from a mobile phone to the speakers in the loo, to the car, and then at home.
Dad, it's on. Turn up the feel good with heart.
So you can see there this radio station promoting a slightly vague FM frequency, somewhere between 96 and 107, you'll find it somewhere. But also on digital radio, also on your mobile, and the new versions of these also include smart speakers highlighted as well. The good news for marketers is that new platforms mean new radio stations. Here are a few examples. Firstly, let's have a bit of Norwegian in this room, possibly for the first time ever.
Tenk at vi I Super får lov til å lage en radiokanal bare for kidsa.
Uten digitalisering av radioen så hadde ikke det vært mulig.
For det nemlig ikke plass til vårt radioprogram Skolefri live på FM.
Hvis du lurer på noe om digitalradio, så det bare å ta kontakt.
Very happy Norwegians talking about what they can do on radio on new platforms, and that can be the internet, that can be smart speakers, as well as different forms of broadcasting radio. They're doing similar things in Australia. Triple M, the big rock station there, now has 3 additional radio stations. Triple M Classic Rock, Triple M Greatest Hits, don't ask me what the difference is, I've got no idea. And Triple M Aussie, 3 additional radio stations within the Triple M family, giving advertisers a wider audience. New technology allows you to do new and interesting things. This is a radio station in a bucket in Uganda. And you might wonder, why is this exciting? Well, this is exciting because the bucket is there to keep everything dry. There's a mobile phone in there which is connecting to various different live streams that it picks up over the internet and rebroadcasts. There's the battery at the bottom, there's a transmitter on the roof. You don't need to worry about the goat. The goat is an optional extra if you get the premium version. My friend Chris used to work in the US. He now works in Manchester in the UK. He used to listen to the country radio stations in the US. There was no country radio in the UK, and so Chris ended up launching one. And he ran it from his attic. It's available across London, across Manchester, across many other cities in the UK. It has tens of thousands of people tuning in every single week, and he's just running this from his attic. Here's a radio station run from somebody's spare room.
I love the music.
Music Radio.
Carolina Classic Hits.
Rick Freeman.
With another hour of the greatest hits of all time. Listen up, coming up, I've got...
Just wanna be your everything.
57 minutes of music, commercial-free, rolling right now.
It's time for the music.
And what's clever about this particular radio station is Rick, who you just heard there, getting very excited about the music he was playing, presents this radio station 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the entire system is completely automated. So he can leave this radio station running. Whenever you tune in, it's a consistent sound. He's always there, but the technology is there doing something that works really, really well for him. And it earns money, which is a great thing. You can launch radio stations for individual audiences as well. This is a radio station in the UK, in London and Manchester, for tradies. Because if you are a tradesperson, you need to know certain things. You need to know a bit more detail about the weather, whether it's going to rain, if you're going to pour concrete down, or if you're going to redo somebody's roof. You need more information about all kinds of things, and also you need to make sure that you don't hear the same songs all the time, which is why fixed radio was born and is working really well as a specific radio station for that specific market. Or here's another example from the US of a radio station in Chinese, which is a market not served too much by radio companies in the US. This is available online. And this, which is one of my favorite examples, this is a radio station for truck drivers who speak Polish. It's available in Europe. In Europe, you have free mobile roaming, so you have free data wherever you are in Europe, which is perfect for a Polish truck driver because, of course, they're driving across all of Europe. They don't speak any other language, and so their own radio station available to them makes an awful lot of sense. So you can do some tremendous new things with new platforms for radio. People's habits are changing in terms of radio. So if you look at young people, they're still listening to an awful lot of radio, as we've already established, but they are listening to a bunch of additional on-demand pieces of content in comparison to older audiences. So there's a big difference in terms of young versus old. There's also a big difference in terms of device as well. Radio is in green on this, and you've got at the top laptops and then tablets and then smartphones and voice-activated speakers. You will see that smartphones is interesting because smartphones has much less radio listening on them than other forms of audio. And maybe that's because we expect more on-demand content on smartphones than we do on other devices. But look how popular live radio is on a smart speaker there. That's why actually when you have a look at streaming, streaming was down a couple of years ago. Live radio streaming was actually down. Why did it start going up again as it is now? Because of smart speakers. So I have a theory that loudspeakers are there for simulcast radio, and simulcast live radio does really well on anything with a speaker, and headphones are there, devices with headphones really work with on-demand content, with podcasting, with additional on-demand content on apps and so on and so forth. The way that we make radio has also changed. When I started working in radio, I'm not quite this old, but when I started working in radio, you would spend tens of millions of dollars on beautiful studios and very carefully put together and lots of equipment in there. Does anybody know who's in the radio industry in here? Does anybody recognize this? Does anybody know what this was used for? Anybody? No, not drugs. Good grief. No, for editing audio, you're absolutely right, yes. So we used to edit audio on tape using razor blades and using Chinagraph pencils and sticky tape and everything else. Now, of course, we use this sort of thing. We use a desktop app that allows us to edit audio together, except we don't necessarily use desktop anymore. We use mobile phones, and except we don't actually use these weird waveforms anymore. We edit using words instead. This is a straightforward app which you can download now. The BBC has a system that allows you to edit audio as if it was a Word document. So you can see here it's automatically worked out what the presenter and what the guest is saying. It's automatically worked out who's talking, and you can see that the producer has already started making some edits in this. Now, somebody at the BBC said, well, this is all very well, but I like printing out the transcript of my interview, and then I go down to the pub, and I cross bits off. I don't want to take my laptop down to the pub. And so the BBC looked at this guy and said, all right, challenge accepted. And they built something which allows them to take it down to the pub. Isn't it brilliant? Public service broadcasting at its best. So you can actually take this down, cross bits off that you want edited out, and then come back and scan these pieces of paper in, and away you go. And if this all sounds a little bit ridiculous and a little bit far-fetched, then this is a piece of technology which you can use right now from your web browser. Let's give it a quick go, and let's see if we can get rid of some of the ums in here.
Thanks so much for taking the time today. Excited to have you on the podcast.
Oh, excited to be here. Thanks, Alex.
So let's just dive right into it. The only time we've reported on you guys on skilled nursing news.
So there's lots and lots of ums and ers in here.
Real estate investment trust. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
So let's go back and let's just edit some of these out. We'll get rid of that and that just make sure that you can see it. Let's get rid of this as well, and that one, and maybe that one down there. There we go. And now let's play that back, and let's see if that sounds any better.
Eric, thanks so much for taking the time today. Excited to have you on the podcast.
Oh, excited to be here. Thanks, Alex.
So let's just dive right into it. The only time we've reported on you guys on skilled nursing news that you went through a re-tenanting recently with MedEquities Real Estate Investment Trust. Why don't you tell me a little bit about that process?
It's pretty cool, isn't it?
And kind of your expansion.
Really, pretty cool. Really, really clever. So the last thing I'm going to talk to you today about is the difference between audio and any other medium. Because I said right at the beginning that radio is all about a shared experience. Radio is all about a human connection. That's what radio is really there for. That is radio's USP. Radio's unique selling proposition is not about playing lots of music, although radio can do. Radio is all about human connection. And that's something that Spotify can't do. That's something that any other algorithmic music service can't do. Radio is best at that human connection. So I wanted to play you a little clip from this guy's breakfast show. He's a man called Greg James. He does the BBC Radio 1 breakfast show. Now, he took over last year, and he took over from a guy who was very popular, very well known, but very good at talking to celebrities and doing all of that celebrity patter and everything else that we get from radio, and that's fine and lovely. But what Greg wanted to do is he didn't want to talk to the stars. He wanted to make his audience the stars instead. He wanted to really amplify that human connection and that shared experience. So Greg was on the radio the previous day, and he was talking about a tweet from Michael Owen, or an interview from Michael Owen, who's a footballer in the UK. Michael Owen had said that he had never ever had a cup of tea in his life. Never had a cup of tea in his life. And so Greg was talking about that, and he ended up having a telephone call.
I'm just a bit shocked at some things that people haven't tried in their life.
Oh yeah, we talked about all these yesterday. So there were people. What were the ones yesterday? There was.
Yeah, there was like chocolate. That's just ridiculous.
The one that you heard last week, we had ex-footballer Michael Owen played an interview from him where he said, "I've never had a cup of tea in my life." That's a bit ridiculous.
I know it's absolutely shocking. I can't get over it.
I've never drunk a cup of tea in my life.
Try tea, for God's sake.
I know, but I think I do have a bit of a weird one that I've not tried before.
Okay.
I've never tried like a pasty, like a Cornish pasty.
Oh right, well I suppose, where are you? I guess you're in Scotland, no?
Yeah, I'm up in Aberdeen.
So Sarah is in Aberdeen, and she has never tried a Cornish pasty. Just in case you don't know, this is a Cornish pasty. Yum. It's a sort of meat and vegetable thing wrapped in a pastry. It's very popular in Cornwall anyway. And Sarah had never tried it because she lives in Aberdeen, and Aberdeen is the other side of the country. And so obviously the radio station got a pasty made for her, obviously, because that's what you would do, isn't it? But what the radio station could have done is got a pasty made for her, send it up with DHL up to Aberdeen, job done. That would have made a nice little bit of radio. But they didn't do that, because that would have been too easy and too straightforward. Instead, they wanted to make the listeners the star. So this pasty, which you can see there in its beautiful box, was then delivered by lots of listeners to that breakfast show up the country in a game of Pass the Pasty. So here is the first listener getting the pasty, drove it up very carefully. Here's Brooke, and Brooke has been driving, has just been given the pasty. There she is, putting the pasty into the car. The next morning, she's driven quite far. She's given it to Louise. Louise is now taking it to her car, and so on. One thing I haven't mentioned is that the pasty has a GPS tracker inside it, because obviously, why wouldn't you? So you can actually see here Cornwall right down at the bottom, Aberdeen right up at the top, and you can actually see where the pasty was. So all of this was being done on the radio, obviously, but also through social media and through other things. And really, it was a game of trying to find out how you could pass the pasty further. Here we are at a train station.
Anybody off to Manchester? Radio 1 needs your help. God, she knows all of that.
So where does it need to go?
I'm handing it over, guys.
Okay. Thank you. I'm at Manchester Piccadilly and I need someone to come and take the pasty off me.
So all the way through this, people were finding out where the pasty was through social media, listening to the radio, finding out where the pasty was. It ended up doing some amazing things, the Pasty, on its way up. It ended up taking part on a race course or something, which is a bit weird. Here you can see it having a trip on the Flying Scotsman, which is a very famous train. I can't believe I just said a very famous train. How embarrassing is that? But anyway, a very famous train. There it is. There it goes. And here it is, nearly getting to Aberdeen. And what better way of bringing it in to Sarah's home than, well, you know, obviously with a proper traditional Scottish pipe band.
Sarah,
Yeah, I'm here.
please take a bite and let me know in your own time what you think of the pasty.
I just need to blow on it. Oh, hot. No. I have no words. This is brilliant!
It's brilliant!
And of course, as you would expect, the story made it into the national papers. Somehow it made good radio. And as you would expect, the story made it into the local papers as well, making the listener the star. And that really is the power of audio. 9 out of 10 people listen every single week to the radio. It's multi-platform now. It's not just AM or FM. It's on demand now as well as being live. And crucially for people here, it's also the media that people consume at the beginning of their purchasing buying day. So when they're busy working out what it is that they should buy, then that is what audio and radio is there for. And finally, it operates as a really good fast food delivery service. Thank you so much for your time. Keep listening, and thanks.